Hello, this is Claudia, and for the next hour I'll be reading from the April 8th issue of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Trump says he has agreed to a 2-week ceasefire with Iran. President Trump announced the deal hours after threatening that a whole civilization will die tonight if Iran did not allow commercial vessels to transit the Strait of Hormuz. President Trump said on Tuesday evening that he had agreed to a 2-week ceasefire with Iran, backing away from an apocalyptic threat he had issued only hours earlier that a whole civilization will die tonight if Iran did not reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Mr. Trump said the ceasefire was subject to the Islamic Republic of Iran agreeing to the complete, immediate, and safe opening of the Strait of Hormuz. Several Iranian officials who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss diplomacy said that Iran had agreed to the deal which Pakistan negotiated. Mr. Trump said he had agreed to a ceasefire because the United States had met and exceeded its military objectives in the bombing campaign and was very far along in efforts to reach a long-term peace deal with Iran. The president posted his statement on social media just over an hour before his deadline of 8 p.m. Eastern Time for Iran to allow unimpeded shipping through the strait or face devastating attacks on its bridges and power plants. The announcement came after the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Shehbaz Sharif, said on social media that diplomatic efforts were progressing steadily, strongly, and powerfully, with the potential to lead to substantive results. Mr. Sharif asked Mr. Trump to extend his deadline by 2 weeks. He also asked Iran to open the strait during the 2-week period and called on both sides to observe a ceasefire during that time. There was no immediate word from Israel about whether it would abide by the ceasefire. While a 2-week pause would not end the war, it buys time for the Trump administration and Iran to work out a longer-term agreement to end the conflict. In the hours before Mr. Trump's deadline, Iranians were bracing for even more devastating American strikes. Striking civilian infrastructure could be a war crime under international law, legal experts say, but Mr. Trump had appeared unconcerned. A whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again, the American president wrote on social media on Tuesday, though he said he hoped maybe something revolutionarily wonderful can happen given the changes in Iranian leadership since the war began. We will find out tonight, one of the most important moments in the long and complex history of the world, he said. A range of figures said that they were appalled by Mr. Trump's comments. Among them, Pope Leo, who called such threats truly unacceptable. A growing number of congressional Democrats called for Mr. Trump to be removed from office and questioned his mental fitness. Iranians formed human chains along bridges and around power plants. Videos and photographs posted by state and local media show, in effect, daring the United States and Israel to kill civilians in order to hit those sites. It was unclear whether the gatherings were arranged by the government, which has organized rallies in its support throughout the war. A spokesman for Iran's foreign ministry, Esmail Bahi, said on social media that Iran would harness all its capacities and capabilities if Mr. Trump carried out its threats to destroy Iranian infrastructure. The power of a civilized nation's culture, logic, and faith in its righteous cause will undoubtedly prevail over the logic of its brute force, he wrote. His response came as U.S. and Israeli forces carried out coordinated attacks on Iran in a bid to force the country to make a deal to reopen the strait, a key oil and gas shipping route, according to American and Israel officials with knowledge of the operations. They spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss sensitive matters. American officials said the U.S. forces had launched more than 90 strikes on Karg Island, Iran's main oil export hub, which is in the Persian Gulf about 20 miles off the coast of mainland Iran. A military official characterized them as restrikes, meaning they hit targets that they had already been struck to inflict more damage. The Israeli military bombed railroads and bridges across Iran. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said in a statement. Mr. Netanyahu said the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps had used the infrastructure to transport weapons and operatives, but the bridges and railroads were also used by civilians. Iranian state media reported that at least 3 people were killed when a railway bridge was hit in the central city of Kashan. Overnight airstrikes on Tehran destroyed a synagogue, Iranian state media said on Tuesday. The Rafiniya synagogue held valuable Torah scrolls that were buried beneath rubble. Homayun Samia Najafabadi, the Jewish community's representative in the Iranian parliament, told an Iranian state broadcaster. The Israeli military said in a statement that it had been targeting a senior Iranian military commander and expressed regret for collateral damage to the synagogue. While some Iranians expressed fear over the prospect of more strikes, others were responding to Mr. Trump's threats with indifference, defiance, or bewilderment. I think Trump is under a lot of pressure and that he has lost his mind, said Lily, a Tehran resident who asked not to use her full name out of concern for repercussions for speaking to foreign media. She and her family were not planning to flee the city, she said, because there was nowhere to go. In the United States, one of the most prominent voices of opposition to Mr. Trump's threatened strikes come from Archbishop Paul S. Coakley, the president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, who issued an unusually forceful statement about the president. The threat of destroying a whole civilization and the intentional targeting of civilian infrastructure cannot be morally justified, Archbishop Coakley said. I call on President Trump to step back from the precipice of war and negotiate a just settlement for the sake of peace and before more lives are lost. In Washington, leading Democrats condemned Mr. Trump's threats to destroy a whole civilization, calling it a promise to commit a war crime. It's unconscionable to threaten the lives of so many people, grandparents, children, families, simply because they were born in Iran, Senator Chuck Schumer of New York, the minority leader, said in a joint statement with Senators Chris Coons of Delaware, Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire, Jack Reed of Rhode Island, and Brian Schatz of Hawaii. The House Minority Leader, Representative Hakeem Jeffries of New York, said in an interview on Tuesday morning that he and his fellow Democrats would try to force another vote on a resolution to rein in Mr. Trump's use of military force in Iran. We only need 1 or 2 additional Republicans, and I think we're on track to securing that, Mr. Jeffries said. He added, Congress must immediately vote to end Donald Trump's reckless war of choice and stop him from getting us into World War III. Despite more than a month of Israeli and American strikes intended to decimate its military, Iran on Tuesday fired more missiles and drones at Persian Gulf countries allied with the United States. Saudi Arabia's defense ministry said that debris from an intercepted missile had fallen near energy facilities in the east and that the damage was being assessed. The U.S. Embassy in Saudi Arabia urged Americans to reconsider journeys to Mecca, the holiest city in Islam, due to the ongoing security situation and intermittent travel disruptions. In the United Arab Emirates, the authorities said that a ballistic missile from Iran had hit a telecommunications company and injured 2 Pakistani citizens. Bahrain said it had intercepted 9 drones, and the U.S. Embassy in Bahrain warned American government workers in the country to shelter in place until further notice. Negotiations to end the war had been meditated by Pakistan and other countries, which had proposed a 45-day ceasefire. On Monday, Iran gave Pakistan a separate 10-point plan to end the war, according to Iranian state media. Mr. Trump said on Monday that the Iranian counterproposal was a significant step, but not good enough. Oil prices plunge and stocks surge after ceasefire deal. Oil prices plummeted and stocks surged on Wednesday as investors cheered a last-minute ceasefire agreement on the war in Iran, offering hope that energy shipments from the Persian Gulf would slowly resume. The ceasefire deal came 90 minutes before a deadline that President Trump had set for Iran to accede to his demands or risk widespread devastation. Neither side has fully agreed to the other's requirements for lasting peace. The deal calls for a 2-week period when the United States would suspend strikes on Iran and Tehran would allow vessels and tankers carrying oil, gas, and other commodities to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, a vital waterway for transit of oil and gas. Oil prices fall sharply. The price of Brent crude, the global benchmark for oil, fell 18% to around $90 a barrel, its lowest in about a month. The price remained about 25% higher than it was before the war. West Texas Intermediate crude, the U.S. benchmark, fell to around $92 a barrel, down more than 20%. The price of this grade of oil remains more than 37% higher since the start of the war. For the past 5.5 weeks, investors and analysts have been focused on the Strait of Hormuz, which normally carries as much as 1/5 of the world's oil supply. Shipping traffic exiting the Persian Gulf through the strait has been effectively halted since the war began, and restoring the flow of energy via the waterway could take time. Stocks jump. Stocks rose around the world on Wednesday. The Stoxx 600 abroad, a European index, bounced 3.5%. The S&P 500 rose 2.5% at the start of trading in New York. The index is now less than 2% lower than it was when the war began. Stocks in Asia, where countries import vast quantities of oil and gas, posted big gains. Japan's Nikkei 225 rose 5.4%, while South Korea's benchmark Kospi index rose nearly 7%. Markets in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and mainland China all posted significant increases. Gasoline prices continue to rise. U.S. gasoline prices rose again on Wednesday, jumping to a national average of $4.16 a gallon, according to the AAA Motor Club. The increase has raised the cost for drivers by 40% since the war began. Gas prices don't move in lockstep with crude, usually trailing increases or drops by a few days. Diesel prices have increased even more quickly and stood at $5.67 on Wednesday, up 51% since the start of the war. What they are saying, normalization will take months, not weeks. Presuming traffic begins to flow through Hormuz, trade flow normalization will take months, not weeks, said Zhui Wang, the director of research and analysis at S&P Global Energy. High prices have already led to cutbacks in energy usage, which is expected to continue, he added, and the strait will face persistent threats for the foreseeable future. It will take months to get oil and gas flowing out of the Persian Gulf. Some wells can be turned on in days or weeks, but bringing the Gulf's energy system back to something akin to normal will take months. Reopening the Strait of Hormuz, a central aim for the United States when it agreed to a ceasefire with Iran, would be the first step toward getting more energy flowing through the Persian Gulf, but only the first step. That is because dozens of refineries, storage facilities, and oil and gas fields in at least 9 countries, from Iran to the United Arab Emirates and beyond, have been targeted in strikes. All told, 10% or more of the world's oil supply has been turned off. Restarting those operations will require not only safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz, but also inspecting pumps, replacing bespoke processing equipment, and recalling employees and ships that have scattered across the globe. It's not a case of you just flick a switch and everything's back up again, said Martin Houston, a longtime oil and gas executive who now serves as board member for several energy companies. The timeline for bringing the Gulf energy system back to some semblance of normal is highly uncertain. For one thing, the war has been paused for only 2 weeks. In the ceasefire deal, which President Trump announced on Tuesday evening, Iran agreed to allow ships to pass through the strait without being attacked. Earlier that day, Mr. Trump said that if the waterway remained closed, a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. He also has repeatedly threatened to strike Iranian power plants and other critical infrastructure if Iran does not allow vessels to pass through the strait, acts that could be considered war crimes. Attacks on energy facilities continued in the days leading up to the ceasefire, including an oil refinery in Kuwait and petrochemical complexes in Iran. How much damage has already been done to the region's infrastructure is difficult to know because many countries have shared little information. Once companies regain confidence that their ships can transit the narrow waterway that runs between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, the first order of business is likely to be shipping out the oil and other fuels that countries close to the strait stockpiled in storage tanks. Then, as long as hostilities do not resume, some wells are likely to flow again within days or weeks, industry analysts and Gulf oil executives say. But a fuller recovery will be a months-long process, they cautioned. And even then, some infrastructure that has sustained extensive damage is expected to take years to repair. For consumers, that means that gasoline prices at the pump, which recently topped $4 a gallon on average in the United States, are unlikely to return to their pre-war levels anytime soon, even though international oil prices fell considerably late Tuesday. Countries are using up stores of energy that they had before the war, so the longer the war drags on, the stickier those high prices are likely to be. The shuttering of oil wells has also other consequences. Once idled, oil and gas wells can be difficult to restart, and the longer they remain closed, the more trouble companies may have turning them back on. The pressure underground can get out of whack while wells are closed. Water can build up. If the shutdowns last a long time, equipment might corrode after being exposed to hydrogen sulfide for too long. The toxic gas, which smells like rotten eggs, is often found mixed in with oil and natural gas. Saudi Arabia and Iraq inject gas or water into many of their wells to coax out more oil, adding another layer of complexity to reestablishing the correct pressure when the time comes to reopen, the research firm Bloomberg NEF wrote recently. Kuwait, which is sandwiched between Saudi Arabia and Iraq at the tip of the Persian Gulf, is the world's 10th largest oil producer. Before Friday, when its Minya Ahmadi refinery was hit by a drone, the chief executive of the state-owned oil company Kuwait Petroleum said he expected to be able to bring out quite a bit of production immediately within a few days of the war's ending. Sheikh Nawaf Asaba, the chief executive, added during remarks late last month at an energy conference, CERAWeek by S&P Global in Houston, that the full production will come within 3 or 4 months. The big question is how much damage has been sustained by all the infrastructure needed to get oil and gas from wellheads to world markets. Analysts say few installations appear to have suffered catastrophic harm, but they are working with limited information about most facilities. One of the most important energy assets in the region is Qatar's natural gas export plant, Ras Laffan. The site, which spans at least 3 square miles in a large industrial city, supplies countries throughout Asia and Europe with natural gas that people use for cooking, heating homes, and generating electricity. Before it can be loaded on a ship, natural gas must be turned into a liquid by cooling it at about minus 260 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 162 degrees Celsius. Qatar stopped making this liquefied natural gas, or LNG, during the early days of the war. Missiles later took out 17% of the site's capacity. The undamaged parts of the facility would be restarted first, likely over a period of weeks or months. Steps include reopening the offshore gas wells that feed the export terminal, restarting any utilities that have been turned off, restocking the inventory of fuels used to cool the gas, known as refrigerants, and then actually cooling the gas, said Mehdi Tool, who spent more than a decade at Ras Laffan and is now the lead LNG specialist at Calypso Commodities, a Berlin company. The damaged portions are another matter. Qatar Energy, which operates Ras Laffan, has said it will take several years to repair those areas and bring them online. The company did not respond to requests for comment. Ras Laffan has 14 LNG producing units. The strikes last month took out the heart of 2 of them, the mammoth structures in which gas is cooled, Qatar's Energy's chief executive told Reuters. That equipment can be as tall as an 18-story building, and the lead time for a new one can run 2 years or more, industry officials said. These facilities were custom engineered and integrated into the broader Ras Laffan complex, making them substantially more difficult to replace than simpler kinds of energy infrastructure, said Najmuddin Meshkati, a professor of engineering at the University of Southern California. Less is known about the extent of the damage to oil processing facilities throughout the region. A refinery on the west coast of Saudi Arabia had been operating at much lower levels after a drone strike in mid-March, according to Rystad Energy, an Oslo-based consulting firm. Rystad estimated that the refinery most likely could be fully restored within a year. Iran has also suffered attacks on its energy infrastructure, including strikes on oil depots in Tehran that turned the sky over the capital city black. One concern for rebuilding is that supply chains for some specialized parts have already been stretched thin. The rush to build data centers for artificial intelligence has created a demand for gas-fired power plants and other energy infrastructure. Many of those facilities rely on equipment like gas turbines that may also be needed to make repairs in the Gulf. If you have the right supply chain, you can get things built back up pretty quickly, said Mike Stice, a University of Oklahoma professor who serves on the board of energy companies, including the U.S. refinery giant Marathon Petroleum. But he added, timelines will depend on a lot of what has been damaged. All it takes is one critical piece of equipment that has a 2-year delivery date. In the end, however the conflict plays out, analysts expect energy prices to eventually fall from wartime levels, but remain higher than they would have been in the absence of war. Analysts at the French bank Société Générale recently said that they expected oil to trade around $80 a barrel at the end of 2026, up from their earlier forecast of $65. Traders will be pricing in a greater risk of geopolitical disruption in the future. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Think airfares are high? Brace yourself for bag fees and fuel surcharges. American and Canadian airlines, squeezed by surging fuel costs from the war in Iran, are adding sticky new bag fees and surcharges on top of higher fees. More airlines are tacking extra fees and surcharges onto already rising ticket prices, hoping to recoup costs as the war in Iran causes fuel costs to surge. Delta Airlines announced on Tuesday it would start charging $10 more to check a bag on U.S. domestic flights following similar baggage fee increases last week by United Airlines and JetBlue. WestJet, Canada's second-largest airline, said on Tuesday that it would add fuel surcharges of up to 60 Canadian dollars or about $43 to some flights a day after Air Canada, the country's largest, rolled out $50 fuel surcharge for flights to warm weather destinations. Porter Airlines, a smaller Canadian carrier, began adding a temporary fuel surcharge of $40 on award flights in late March. Fuel is the largest contributor to airline operating costs, and a temporary surcharge helps us manage the recent surge in fuel prices, WestJet said in a statement, noting that fuel typically accounts for about 20% of an airline's costs. The carrier also said it would temporarily cut some lower demand flight routes. Since the war in Iran began on February 28th, U.S. jet fuel costs have climbed more than 87% to $4.69 a gallon on Monday, according to Argus Media. When fuel prices rise, airlines don't just absorb the hit, they pass it along, often in ways that are less obvious than a higher ticket price, said Sarah Rathner, a travel and credit card expert at the personnel finance website NerdWallet. Bag fees, seat selection costs, and new surcharges can quietly inflate the cost of a trip. Airfares, both domestic and international, have also jumped since the war started, according to an analysis of economy round-trip tickets by the travel search engine Kayak. On March 30th, an average international trip cost $998, compared with $774 on February 23rd, and a domestic U.S. trip cost $350, compared with $336 on February 23rd. Asian carriers have already reduced flight schedules and adopted substantial fuel surcharges, such as Cathay Pacific's $200 extra for select long-haul flights. Japan Airlines is charging up to $164 more for fuel for flights between Japan and North America or Europe. Jet fuel shortages are more pronounced in Asia and other international markets because of their reliance on Middle Eastern oil, said Robert Mann, an aviation industry consultant and a former airline executive. Mr. Mann cautioned that the extra fees may not be quick to disappear, and that generally fuel surcharges are more expensive than bag fees. Higher fares and fees tend to be very sticky once imposed, he said. Once airline managers see that travels will tolerate higher fees and fares, why reduce them? People who have yet to book summer travel are likely to see prices only go up, Mr. Mann noted. Travelers may also find that they have fewer options. In a recent airline industry report by Deutsche Bank, analysts noted that the global airlines have already begun trimming less popular routes and cautioned that if jet fuel prices remain persistently high and oil shortages become more pronounced in Asia and Australia and spread to Europe, airlines could even cut their most lucrative long-haul routes. We see that as a risk that increases by the day as long as the Strait of Hormuz remains shut, the report reads. The women who believe that women should lose the right to vote, adherents to biblical patriarchic support household voting, one household, one vote, the husbands. They say the idea is catching on. When they prayed on the Sunday after Valentine's Day, as on other Sundays, most of the women at Kingsway Reformed Church in the old mining town of Prescott, Arizona, wore dainty kerchiefs knotted over their hair to show devotion to God. Mary Belle East, age 36, wore hers all the time, she said, 7 days a week, for him to see that I submit to his authority, her husband's authority, that is. Her headscarf is a physical reminder of biblical patriarchy, the kind of marriage the church preaches. It keeps me from running my mouth, she said. To her and other women, patriarchy also means ceding their political voices to their husbands. They believe America would be better off if women could not vote. The Easts and their children had driven 2 hours from the Phoenix area to hear Dale Partridge, the 40-year-old pastor based on the outskirts of Prescott, in a brick and glass event space set between a regional airport and a modest golf course. On social media, the pastor has attracted a following by posting incendiary commentary, rallying against feminists, Catholics, and gay people, describing immigration as national suicide, and labeling Islam and Hinduism demonic. He also calls for erasing women's suffrage, which he lists as one reason the world is falling apart. The 1920 passage of the 19th Amendment, the landmark legislative achievement of the movement to make women equal citizens, made it possible for women across America to vote, but for Mr. Partridge and a growing number of like-minded Christians, it drove America into national decline. Instead, they support household voting, one household, one vote, the husbands. While many Americans would see this as unthinkable, regression to a time when women were treated as second-class Americans, proponents of the concept believe deeply that this arrangement is what God envisioned in a marriage. If a decade ago the idea was just another extreme provocation, today it is gaining adherents beyond the fringe. Male influencers and podcasters in the ultra-conservative corner of the internet known as the manosphere, often pushed to repeal the 19th, and far-right young women have also backed the idea. I used to teach this as this is the fringe thing that's out there. Now I teach it as this is no longer fringe, said Beth Allison Barr, a history professor at Baylor University, author of The Making of Biblical Womanhood and advocate for women's equality in the church, who said she has heard household voting and biblical patriarchy being discussed increasingly in evangelical circles. It's being made to sound more palatable and reasonable. Even Mr. Partridge is surprised at how fast the conversation has shifted. Just a few years ago, you'd be slaughtered talking about this, he said. And now? Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth shared a clip last summer of pastors in his ultra-conservative denomination, which holds that America is a Christian nation, whose laws should reflect Christian tenets, arguing that women should be barred from voting. In 2024, the popular conservative wellness podcaster Alex Clark said on her show that she wouldn't mind if it was just the male head of the household that voted. A prominent anti-abortion activist who spoke at the 2020 Republican National Convention, Abby Johnson, has also endorsed household voting. The church Mr. Partridge founded out of his house with a few people in 2021 now has more than 100 parishioners attending every Sunday, with 5 to 10 new families joining every year, he said. They're coming from Phoenix and Minnesota and Las Vegas, from Canada, and from as far away as Germany. Early adoption of any particular idea always seems strange to the mass, the pastor said in a recent interview in Prescott, where he lives with his wife, Veronica Partridge, and 4 children. But then a few years later, the mass is there and you're not as weird as everybody thought you were. To people at Kingsway, feminism is what's weird, and women holding civil authority or voting independently is what's unnatural. The results just speak for themselves, Ms. Partridge, age 36, said of Female Independence. Everybody seems more stressed out, angry, frustrated with one another, depressed. Every democracy in the world has universal suffrage, and repealing the 19th Amendment would require approval by 3/4 of the states, an exceedingly unlikely prospect. But Mr. Partridge said that as more Americans embrace traditional gender roles, he foresaw red states throwing up barriers to women's suffrage. Some obstacles to women voting could come sooner. President Trump and Republican allies are pushing legislation that would require proof of citizenship to register to vote, a restriction that opponents say could disenfranchise the many women whose married names do not match those on their birth certificates or other documents. As an untested model, household voting still has some basic problems. People at Kingsway acknowledged unmarried women, they suggested, could be represented by fathers, brothers, or uncles. But in their ideal, women would be married and only to men. Gay couples have no place in this system. Supporters say women's suffrage divided wives from husbands, rupturing the unity of what the Bible describes as one flesh. They argue that what they describe as women's natural tenderness makes them dangerously susceptible to supporting immigration-friendly candidates and liberal policies. Prominent conservatives, including Ali Beth Stuckey, the Christian podcaster, and Ben Shapiro have also rallied about what Ms. Stuckey calls women's toxic empathy, though they stop short of advocating barring women from voting. Don't allow that love and compassion to paralyze your brain from thinking, especially when we are making policy decisions, Ms. Stuckey said in a January podcast episode about liberal women's opposition to the immigration crackdown in Minneapolis, adding, "All of these good things about us make us more susceptible to lies." Household voting supporters take that thinking to an extreme. Politics is by nature warlike, said Corbin Clark, age 29, a Kingsway assistant pastor and UPS driver who moved his family to Prescott from Indiana in 2023. Women weren't made for battle. He added they were made for love, they were made for beauty. His wife, Haley Clark, age 34, quickly agreed. God designed it that way, she said. Her husband guides her through any hard-to-understand political issues, she said, but as Republicans, we have the same view on everything. For supporters, household voting stems intuitively from what they call biblical patriarchy. In patriarchal marriages, husbands hold ultimate authority with wives in submission. If you're a patriarch of your home and your voice is the voice of your home, then it should be that way in politics as well, Mr. Clark said. Many mainstream evangelical Christians have long embraced a softer version known as complementarianism, which holds that men and women have equally valuable but different roles. Both frameworks draw from the New Testament book of Ephesians, which instructs wives to submit yourselves to your own husbands, as you do to the Lord, and husbands to love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. In practice, many complementarian marriages can resemble secular egalitarian ones. Couples come to a consensus on most decisions. Perhaps one meaningful difference is that, in theory, husbands cast the tiebreaker if needed. Though it has roots in older thinking, biblical patriarchy was popularized in the 1990s and early 2000s by Doug Phillips, the influential founder of Vision Forum Ministries, who also championed household voting. He later resigned over an infidelity scandal. These days, its best-known spokesman is Doug Wilson, the pastor who built Mr. Hegseth's denomination and believes America should be a theocracy. Mr. Wilson's books on marriage form a spiritual roadmap for Kingsway and kindred churches. A man penetrates, conquers, colonizes, plants, Mr. Wilson has written. A woman receives, surrenders, accepts. Adherents to biblical patriarchy scorn complementarianism as sop to feminism. The result, weak, watered-down patriarchy, leads to marital chaos, they say. The Clarks' first year of marriage before adopting patriarchy was the most tumultuous year of our life together, Mr. Clark said, describing fights over budgeting, job changes, when to start having children, and whether to baptize them. It was, who's in charge, he added, where does the buck stop? Embracing wifely submission, he said, established harmony. Miss Clark's role as homemaker, mother, and good helpmate to her husband, she said, makes for a very simple, beautiful life. Kingsway couples portray their life as a return to a better time of white picket fences and whole families. They cite the 1950s as inspiration, or the 1880s, or even Puritan America, before the upheavals of feminism, birth control, no-fault divorce, legalized abortion, and other policies that granted women rights and independence. Patriarchy supporters would like to see them rolled back. Critics say this view of the past ignores its harsh reality for many people, including non-whites and anyone who could not survive on a male breadwinner's income alone. It sells because it's attractive and soothing and speaks to our longing for order in the midst of chaos, said Tia Levings, the author of A Well-Trained Wife, a memoir about leaving her patriarchal marriage, who counsels other women who have been abused in such marriages and writes a newsletter about Christian fundamentalism. Her book describes how her husband changed after reading Mr. Wilson's books about marriage, the same ones that influenced Mr. Partridge. Demanding she call him my lord, he began spanking her with a belt for disobeying him. Mr. Wilson has warned against spanking wives, but has written that wives should be led with a firm hand, phrasing that critics say encourages harsh discipline. The ultimate goal is to have women at home, out of the arena, out of public society, silent and procreating, Miss Levings said. In early America, the common law concept of coverture gave wives no separate legal existence from their husbands. In the name of marital unity, wives had no control over property or legal right to their children. Husbands were legally responsible even for their wives' crimes. In most places, only white property-owning men could vote. In some, voting was limited to Christian men, a restriction some people at Kingsway said they hoped to restore. States began relaxing the property requirement in the early 1800s. Mississippi became the first to begin dismantling coverture in 1839. To hear the couples at Kingway's that February Sunday tell it, patriarchal wives are freer than others. Sheltered from the burdens of decision-making and political participation, I trust my husband. I know that he's a good man. I know he's a godly man, said Tara Caldwell, age 42. She and her husband and 5 sons were visiting from Las Vegas. They plan to move later this year to the joined Kingsway. Submitting took practice for Miss Caldwell, a former dietitian. There have been times where I've had to swallow my pride and be like, okay, this is not what I want, but I know God wants me to submit to my husband, she said. God's going to reward me when I get to heaven for my obedience. Her husband, Jesse Caldwell, an Air Force pilot, said, in biblical patriarchy might invoke some cowering women in the corner and some ridiculously machismo jerk of a husband just lording it over her. In reality, they said, he routinely consults her on decisions, often changing his mind after she appeals. The husbands interviewed emphasized that they were required to lead according to biblical principles, not as tyrants, and to take responsibility for their family sins. It is a vision of masculinity, disciplined and resolute, that the husband said is the clear appeal for men. In his sermon on marriage that Sunday, Mr. Partridge called on men to step up and provide so that their wives would be free to be feminine. You need to take responsibility to offer the vision, the mission, the focus, the direction for your own family, he said. You're not a guy who is playing video games all day. Miss Levings, the writer, said she had seen patriarchal expectations pile unrealistic pressure on men, including many not up to the task. If he's depressed, you still have to submit, she said. If he's an alcoholic, you still have to submit. Bailey Jones, who moved to Prescott and joined Kingsway with her husband in 2023, said she grew up seeing the opposite model, with her mother, a full-time nurse, dominating her father. Miss Jones, age 31, who worked as the Forest Service and in retail before giving birth last year, chose a marriage more like the ones at Kingsway. Aghast, her mother walked out of their son's baptism. She thinks I'm under a dictatorship and all this stuff, Miss Jones said at the church's after-service potluck. The only dictator in our household is this guy, said her husband, Zachary Jones, age 32, smiling at the baby, who sat in a carrier in front of them. Yet Miss Jones said she was inclined to forgive her mother. She was still family, after all. But Mr. Jones, a county prosecutor, saw things differently. Though there had been a thaw in the relationship, he said he had to be firm about what was good for the family, which might not include seeing her mother too often. He added that he still discussed decisions with his wife. Sometimes he admitted he was wrong. Who would want to live in a marriage or a household where your wife hates you, he said. Still, giving someone that you care about everything they want, if what they want isn't ordered according to some higher purpose, that's not good either. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. To boost military budget, Trump targets popular programs at home. Amid the war with Iran, the president has proposed to scale back some of the very programs meant to ease families' financial burdens. For decades, the U.S. government has helped poor Americans pay their home heating and cooling bills. It sends money to states, which then administer the aid, assisting nearly 6 million households nationally. With a roughly $4 billion budget, the bipartisan program known as LIHEAP is just a sliver of a sprawling federal balance sheet that ranges well into the trillions each year, yet it counts among the vast set of federal aid that President Trump is trying to eliminate as he scrounges for ways to cut costs at home and fund a larger, more expensive military. Mr. Trump has eyed a series of potentially unpopular and divisive domestic spending cuts for the next fiscal year in a move that may test the political appetite and financial health of a cost-weary American public. Even as voters grow frustrated with the economy and seem eager to exact their vengeance at the ballot box, the president has proposed to scale back some of the very federal programs that are meant to ease families' toughest financial burdens. By the president's own reasoning, the U.S. government could not afford the expense. At a private lunch last week, Mr. Trump insisted that Washington needed to prioritize military protection above all else, especially with the United States still at war with Iran. Otherwise, he said in a since-deleted video, the country could not continue to shoulder the financial burden of services including daycare, Medicare, and Medicaid. Formalizing that view in his 2027 budget, Mr. Trump did not address Medicare and Medicaid directly, but he did ask Congress to slash about $73 billion next fiscal year across a wide array of domestic agencies and programs, including education, healthcare, housing, and nutrition assistance. He coupled that call for cuts with a request to ratchet up military spending by more than $400 billion, which would amount to one of the largest one-year boosts in modern history. Mr. Trump's approach angered congressional Democrats and even some Republicans months after the two parties banded together to reject broad swaths of his last year's budget. That included his previous attempt to eliminate LEHEAP, formerly known as Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, which Congress not only preserved this fiscal year but also supplied with additional funding. In an interview, Representative Hakeem Jeffries, Democrat of New York, and the minority leader called Mr. Trump's latest budget an extraordinary admission of Republican policy cruelty that they've been inflicting on the American people in real time since the very beginning of his presidency. Mr. Jeffries said he was extremely optimistic that Democrats would win back control of the House in November by a large margin, partially because of Mr. Trump's actions. He added, Republicans don't give a damn about making life more affordable for the American people. The White House has sought to frame its actions much differently. In a letter accompanying the president's budget, Russell T. Vought, the budget director, wrote last week that the goal is to ensure that the United States continues to maintain the world's most powerful and capable military. Turning to the proposed cuts, Mr. Vought described many of the targeted programs as wasteful or woke, adding that the administration has aimed to use every tool at its disposal to achieve real savings. The White House also claimed in a statement on Tuesday that it had targeted LEHEAP in particular because the money was riddled with fraud and was not needed because states could fill the gap on their own. A spokeswoman added that the funds had disproportionately benefited Democrats. For Mr. Trump, the renewed debate over federal spending nevertheless arrives at a perilous political and economic moment. Before the bombing began, many Americans had reported frustration with stubbornly high prices, even though the president routinely dismissed concerns about affordability as a hoax. But public angst has only intensified as Mr. Trump has ratcheted up his wartime threats, sending the average price at the pump to $4.14 per gallon nationally on Tuesday. The geopolitical uncertainty has also rattled financial markets, creating new headaches for Americans' retirement and savings. They see the price, they remember it, said Mark Wolf, the executive director of the National Energy Assistance Directors Association, referring to oil and gas costs. Mr. Wolf, whose group advocates the government's low-income energy assistance programs, added, people are concerned about it. With no end to the hostilities in sight, economists have warned that other tumult may soon follow. High oil prices could soon translate to higher costs for groceries and other shipped goods, causing potential slowdown in the nation's growth, a worsening in unemployment, and in worst-case scenario, a possible U.S. recession. Throughout the war, Mr. Trump has brushed aside any economic fallout as non-existent, temporary, or inconsequential, arguing that the United States needed to neutralize an imminent nuclear threat. But the president's bombing campaign was only the latest in a string of recent military entanglements, which prompted the White House to seek about $1.5 trillion for defense in the 2027 budget, unveiled on Friday. As part of that request, Mr. Trump called on Congress to raise pump for lower ranking troops, increase money for naval warships, ramp up a new missile defense system, and replenish U.S. munitions. If enacted, it would be the second increase for the military during the president's second term after he secured roughly $150 billion in new funds for the Pentagon as a part of his sweeping package of tax cuts last year. Democrats vigorously objected to the president's military request, and many took quick issue with the way he sought to offset it, arguing that Mr. Trump had essentially asked the public to front the costs for a war that it did not want. Mr. Jeffries, for one, described the approach as an open acknowledgement that the Republican Party is all about warfare, not health care. Mr. Trump proposed to slash more than $15 billion at the Department of Health and Human Services, once again targeting federally funded medical research, though the cuts he sought were less stark than those proposed 1 year ago. The White House also called for revoking about $15 billion in money meant to combat climate change, reprising its desire to eliminate funds that improve clean energy and clamp down on harmful emissions. Together, those cuts and others would sum to a roughly 10% reduction in all domestic spending, according to White House estimates. The depth of those changes troubled at least one senior Republican, Senator Susan Collins of Maine, who leads the Appropriations Committee. In a statement last week, she said the president's budget had shortcomings, pointing to cuts for programs like LIHEAP. After careful review, Congress decisively rejected these particular cuts last year, she said. Some of Mr. Trump's harshest proposals targeted money meant to improve lending to minority communities and small businesses, while others reprised the president's attempt to eliminate the Education Department. And his administration pursued a series of changes to federal nutrition assistance, one of which could reduce the amount that low-income families receive for fruit and vegetables under the Women, Infants, and Children program, according to anti-hunger groups. Mr. Trump did recommend a substantial increase in emergency WIC funds. Still, his proposal followed less than a year after Republicans cemented new restrictions under the government's largest anti-hunger initiative known as food stamps, which serves roughly 42 million Americans. Millions are expected to lose benefits in the coming years as a result of the new criteria, which lawmakers imposed to pay for a portion of their expensive package in tax cuts. On Capitol Hill, some Republicans have openly signaled that they could adopt a similar approach in the coming fiscal year as they look for ways to deliver Mr. Trump's request for more military funding. Party leaders are expected to try to boost defense using the same special legislative tactic that had allowed them to adopt their tax package over Democratic objections in 2025. We just addressed Medicaid and SNAP, but there are 70-plus means-tested welfare programs across this entire people's government and about $1.5 trillion cost, said Representative Jody Arrington of Texas, the Republican chairman of the Budget Committee, referring to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. He added in the interview, which appeared on Fox Business, that the programs could be mined for potential savings by rooting out fraud. Democrats have seized on those comments as they try to make the case to voters that they would be harmed if Republicans remain in control of Congress. Many anti-poverty advocates have echoed those warnings about the stark effects of spending cuts at a moment when families are already facing serious financial headaches. The money you're spending already on a department that's overly funded instead of helping working-class Americans, which is a big part of our population, it is going to impact everyone, said Gina Platanino, the SNAP director for the Food Research and Action Center, which supports the program. Some experts said that Mr. Trump's budget appeared at times to undermine his own agenda. He proposed to cut more than $10 billion at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, for example, by targeting a series of programs that foster community development, combat homelessness, and help low-income people obtain affordable rentals. The budget request followed months after the president promised to take aggressive action to make housing more affordable. In a statement, a spokeswoman for the White House Budget Office said that it sought to strip the HUD budget of a nonsense Americans should not be paying for. Sarah Brundage, the president of the National Association of Affordable Housing Lenders, said that the sum total of cuts at HUD seemed to contradict the president's own stated commitment to affordability. Mr. Trump stopped far short of the more dramatic overhaul to housing assistance that he proposed last year, which lawmakers rejected anyway, as they realized the impact it would have on their states and congressional districts. Still, Mr. Jeffries said he was astounded that this was the platform on which Republicans were choosing to campaign in an election year. make it make sense, he said. It does not. Faces of Death set the bar for hardcore horror. It's back. A remake of the cult horror movie raises questions about the approach to viewing disturbing videos in a new era. A few years ago, producers approached the filmmakers Daniel Goldhaber and Isa Mazzia with an idea. They had secured the rights to Faces of Death, the 1978 cult horror movie that had even some of the most hardcore fans of the genre have been wary of watching. In it, a deadpan narrator named Dr. Francis B. Gross, guides the viewer through a series of gruesome, real depictions of animals and humans shuffling off their mortal coils. The producers wanted to know if Goldhaber and Mazzi were interested in making a new Faces of Death for a new moment. The first thing the pair did was watch the original for the first time. I realized, I've seen parts of this already, Mazzi, age 35, said in a video interview. As a millennial who spent her formative years immersed in early iterations of social media, she had seen isolated clips from the film around the web. Goldhaber, age 34, and Mazzi were already mulling a project about living online. His experience as a content moderator for Friends fly-by-night social media set up in the 2010s showed him a venue in which digital expression and human nature elevated snuff videos and pornography. The duo had made Cam, aged year 2018, a mystery about a sex worker on a webcam site, and would next release How to Blow Up a Pipeline, 2023, which told the story of young environmental activists carrying out the act of the title. Goldhaber directed. Mazzi was a screenwriter on Cam and a producer on Pipeline. Both films embedded polemical social commentary within hardy commercial genres, the thriller and the heist movie. Might the deep things they wanted to say about the internet, about the attention economy and its perverse incentives, about the bending and burning of shared facts, fit into a new take on a decades-old, decidedly lo-fi, simulated snuff film? Apparently, yes. The new movie in theaters April 10th follows the content moderator at a TikTok-like app who suspects that viral videos reenacting scenes from the original Faces of Death are actually films of real murders. She sets out to track down the ostensible killer. A scary cat-and-mouse pursuit ensues. Faces of Death is a horror film at a moment when horror films are the closest thing to box office slam dunks, and a reboot at a moment when franchises are everything, and at the same time a meta-commentary on all of the above. As one character says, the algorithm loves remakes. People love remakes. If it's a remake, you can get away with murder. We're intending to ask the question in this film, why remake Faces of Death? Goldhaber said in an interview, it's a bit telling that a large corporation thinks that's monetizable IP. The original Faces of Death thrived among horror aficionados, browsing video store aisles at a time when rumors circulated about its authenticity. Adam Lowenstein, a University of Pittsburgh professor who directs the school's Horror Studies Center, recalled that Faces was one of the first movies he wanted to watch when he received a VHS player for his bar mitzvah in the 1980s. There's something about movies being in this intimate space in the home that's different than going to a theater, Lowenstein said. The cultural imagery was affected by that. Watching movies became a private thing. As part of the horror subgenre of faux documentary, The Original Faces of Death, which will be released on 4K Ultra HD this month through Vinegar Syndrome, further undermined the viewer's ability to feel safe knowing that real is real and fake is fake. When a horror film is presented in the form of a documentary, said Cecilia Sayed, a senior lecturer in the film at the University of Kent, it disrupts our expectations about the reliability of documentary. But Goldhaber and Mazzi's Faces of Death is different. They pitched this really on the moment, take that. Stood out from everybody else's, says Susan Montford, one of the film's producers. Combining heartfelt argument with compelling narrative is the stock-in trade of Goldhaber and Mazzi, who have known each other since high school in Boulder, Colorado. Cam originated conceptually as a documentary about cam girls. Mazzi said before evolving into a narrative feature, How to Blow Up a Pipeline was a 2021 work of nonfiction by a Swedish academic, Andreas Malm, that made the argument for illicit sabotage in the name of the environment, while the film is a narrative about young activists and their motivations. Ocean's 11 about eco-terrorism, as Goldhaber put it on the New Models podcast. What is the best way to get the audience to relate to an experience that maybe they want to instinctively demonize, Mazzi said. The answer is genre, a film where you are baking the audience inside the idea. You are raising their adrenaline. They are scared with the character. They are rooting for the character, and they come out of it with a new understanding and empathy. So it figured that when confronted with Faces of Death, Goldhaber and Massey had the instinct not to remake it strictly, but rather to use it as a jumping-off point to examine contemporary issues of violence and media disruption. This is a Faces of Death in which the characters watch the original Faces of Death on VHS, of course. Shooting began days after Pipeline hit theaters in the spring of 2023. The next year, the film was pulled from the South by the Southwest Festival slate days. Before a scheduled screening, Goldhaber said Legendary Entertainment, the initial producer, did not reply to a request for comment. It took a while for the film to be acquired for distribution by IFC and Shudder. In a turn that could have been borrowed from the film itself earlier this year, YouTube pulled its first trailer for content violation, Goldhaber said. There are actual corpses shown in the Faces of Death, Goldhaber said, and glimpses of real viral videos that the lead character, Margot Barbie Fiera, encounters as a content moderator and in some original Faces of Death footage. That's the provocation, said Goldhaber. We've all accepted this stuff on our phones because large corporations depend on our attention and our addiction to looking at our screens. But we have this older form of media, cinema, going where it feels more taboo. Squabbling over real video can feel quaint today in an era of ever more compelling deep fakes. The movie is set in 2024. We didn't update it when we came out in 2026 because everyone would be like, oh, it's AI, Goldhaber said. But I think the disruption of reality we are pointing out was evident 2 to 5 years ago. Faces of Death provides all the ingredients of a horror flick recipe. There's an antagonist, there's a scary house, there are terrified women fleeing from the heated pursuit. But it is difficult to overlook a moral streak that runs throughout the film. A world that places a premium on social media clicks is, it turns out, not a great place. We say that if you're getting attention, you have value, Goldhaber said. If you commit an act of mass violence, you will receive a tremendous amount of attention. So we're telling people, if you commit an act of mass violence, you have value. That dynamic, the filmmakers are saying, risks making attention mongers of everyone. Here, he's an extreme example of that, but there are definitely aspects of Arthur that I relate to, said Massey of Montgomery's character. I am someone who posts on social media. I am someone who wants attention online. Aren't we all? You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the April 8th issue of the New York Times. Your reader has been Claudia, and I thank you for listening.